and Rural Partners, which is the Illinois Rural Development Council. My name is Ann Silvis. I'm with University of Illinois Extension, and I also serve on the board of directors for Rural Partners. So I'm actually wearing two hats today, Extension and Rural Partners. As we get started, I just wanted to give you a few housekeeping details. We have a lot of people on the line, so please mute your mic and stop your questions. Please use the chat space and we'll be monitoring that. If you're having audio difficulty, post those questions in the chat space and we'll provide some technical assistance where we can. This webinar will be recorded and will be Laura Kessel, who will moderate today's session at University School of Medicine. And she's also serving as chair of the board of directors for Rural Partners. So that's the hat she's wearing today. So Laura, thank you so much for your leadership at Rural Partners and for co-sponsoring this webinar.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks to Extension for working with us on this and hosting. So our panelists today bring a wealth of experience to this topic. I'd like to introduce Christopher Mooney, who's the W. Russell Arrington Professor of State Politics in the Political Science Department at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Brian Gaines is a professor at the University of Illinois with appointments in the Department of Political Science, as well as the Institute of Government and Public Affairs. And Michael McDonald is an associate professor of political science at University of Florida. So we are looking forward to hearing from them today about the redistricting process and the political future of Illinois. And I am going to turn it over to you, Chris.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Laura, and thanks for having us today. I'm very happy to get involved with Rural Partners and the Extension. I've been a big fan of Extension for many years, and glad to see you guys keeping up the good work. Our basic plan is to go in 3 parts, and I'm going to talk briefly. Well, you should talk about maybe 10 or 15 minutes. I'm going to talk first of all, give a little background on redistricting, what it is, why we do it. Then Brian is going to step in and talk about challenges in Illinois and some of the local issues, because he's heavily involved in the Champaign County redistricting, as I understand it. And then Mike is going to finish up and talk about some of the special challenges of the 2001 redistricting process / census that we're all having to deal with, especially here in Illinois. Okay, all right. Sorry, I muted myself. Okay. There we go. Okay, so what is redistricting and what's it all about, right? Okay, so in every governmental district with an elected legislative body where districts are used, right, as opposed to at-large elections, right? If you've got a legislative body in this country and it's got districts, somebody's got to figure out where those district boundaries go, right? And in a typical single member district set up for a legislative body, the entire geographic space of the jurisdiction of that government has to be divided into districts such that every square inch of land is allotted to one and only one legislative district. There can't be a space where there's nobody, there can't be an overlap. It's got to be exactly there. And each one of ththese boundaries has to be determined by somebody. Somebody's got to say, this is going down 21st Street rather than 22nd Street, or we're going to take a left on Cumberland rather than on Cullerton. Somebody's got to make those kind of decisions. And these questions matter because they determine, number one, who the voters are going to be in each district. And then that determines who's going to win that district. And so it matters for democracy, right? And it matters for public policy and who's getting in office and party control and so forth. But so it matters for democracy, but it really matters for politicians. I mean, in general, it's a good idea. It's something we all care about for democracy, but who really cares about it are the people who either are in the legislative body at the moment or they think they may want to get into that legislative body. Then it matters which side of the street that line is drawn on. You know, there's an old saw that's a bit apocryphal, but they say that the reason that Barack Obama was president of the United States is because of redistricting. He ran against Bobby Rush in 2000, I think it was, in a congressional seat up here in Chicago. Didn't win, got slaughtered in the primary, but made Rush nervous. And so when they redid the map for 2002, surprisingly, Barack Obama's house was now in Jesse Jackson Jr.'s district. And in those days, Jesse Jackson Jr. Couldn't be beat on the South Side. So, you know, and then therefore Obama had to look around because Michelle didn't want to be in the state Senate forever. And said, well, there's a Senate seat. Maybe I'll run for that. And a few other lucky things happened, and he became senator and president, blah, blah, blah. So remap matters to individual politicians in a big way. And it also matters to democracy in probably less direct way. You know, demographics can't be overcome completely, but the way you cut up a district can have a marginal effect on who gets elected, on what parties win, and the policies that gets passed. For example, I'm trying to move things. There we go. Okay, so let's pretend this is a state, right? We'll call this Colorado. That it looks like just exactly like Colorado. And let's say that it's a state. We got to split it up into 3 districts. And the way I've drawn it here is we've got blue people living in sort of 75% of the district or the state, and red people living in 25% of the state. And everybody lives exactly this way. So it's not intermixed like normal. But anyway, but just pretend this is a real state. And we've got to cut this up into 3 districts. Now, we could cut it up like this. And so this district is all blue. This district is all blue. And then this district here, it's got a bunch of red and some blue. So the result of this looks to me like you're going to get 1 blue, 2 blue, and 1 red member. 2 blue members and 1 red member. So in some sense, this looks pretty representative, right? Because this whole state's got 75% blue, and now we're going to get 66% blue, so something like that. On the other hand, you could do it the same exact place, and you split it up like this. And you could just basically split these things into thirds. And so in this case, each of the 3 districts is going to have 75% blue and 25% red. And in the result of this one would be 100% blue in the legislature. And you know, my question to you is, what's the fair map? What's the fair map? We hear a lot about fair map, right? Tell me what the fair map is, right? Here we get the overall legislature kind of reflects the population somewhat, you know, 2 to 1 sort of thing. Here, the individual districts reflect the population. Right, because each one is sort of a quarter red and 3/4. But the result is that red gets 0 representation in the legislature, right? So which one is fair? I'm not going to say, well, I'm not going to answer that question because I don't think there is an answer to that question that's objective that everybody can say. I mean, people, the phrase fair map is basically a political tool rather than something that actually is an objectifiable fact. So it matters where we draw these lines, right? Because legislative district maps are drawn and can affect elections and everything that flows from the elections, the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in on this issue back in the 60s in a series of groundbreaking and really gut-wrenching decisions. And up to this point, the Supreme Court had said, well, it's a political issue. But in the early 60s, said, nah, this is getting way out of whack. We have to step here and deal with this. The court's conclusion in all these cases was basically that all districts in the same legislative body have to be equal in population, more or less, and different kind of standards. But basically, you have to have all your districts being equal in population. And the reason you do that is because if one district's population is substantially less than another's, then the voters are going to get in the smaller district get more representation. And we can see that how the example for in Illinois, for example, what if the state of Illinois gave each of our states, each county, one state senator. So we'd have 102 senators in the state legislature, and every county got one, right? Sounds fair, right? Every county gets one. But the problem is you're going to end up with old Pope County down here, lovely Pope County down in the bottom of the state with 50 or 4,200 people living in it, having the same representation as Cook County, up here, which has got 5.5 million people. So obviously one person in Pope County is a lot better representation into this system, a lot better than a person living in Cook County. So, and that was seen as patently unfair by the Supreme Court. They said, no, that's not right. The basis of representation is the voter. It's not land, right? It's not counties, it's the voter. So you have to divide up districts based on the number of people living in the counties. Now I say voter, I say people, is it citizens, is it non-citizens? Basically the Supreme Court's all about people at this point. Although obviously that's a political discussion that's been going on for the last year or so. This situation sounds a little crazy, right? With Pope County versus Cook County having equal representation in the legislative body. Before the 60s, it wasn't that far off in some places, right? I think Connecticut and Tennessee were maybe Colorado were some of the key places where they were really whacked out. And for some of the same reasons, like there was urban areas were way underrepresented. And what happened was that, redistricting is a huge pain in the neck. It's very emotionally painful, lots of conflict. You're going to find that out over the next year if you don't know that already. And so, states were basically just didn't redistrict throughout the early 20th century. At least many of them didn't. And so as they set up their districts, sort of 1900 or 1880 or whatever, and they just let it ride. And the problem is that during the course of the 20th century, as we all know, there was a massive change in population in terms of who lived where. And basically in one direction, people going from the farm and going to the city, right? And so urban areas exploded, rural areas decreased. And so that means that if you have the same districts you drew in 1900 and you're using them in 1960, then the rural areas are going to be way overrepresented than the urban areas, and that's precisely the situation that we had in the U.S. Supreme Court said no, that's unfair based on the 14th Amendment. It's not equal. It's not the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is seen as unfair. Okay, so one quick hypothetical, or say rhetorical question for you, since we got this massive thing and I can't ask a question. What legislative body in the United States do we see this kind of malapportionment, as it's called, today in spades, right? Kind of like this Pope County versus Cook County thing. The answer is U.S. Senate. The U.S. Senate is an extreme example of malapportionment. And in fact, there are more people living in Cook County than in the 7 smallest states combined, okay? And that means that those 7 states have 14 U.S. senators. 14% of the U.S. Senate represents fewer people than live in Cook County. Okay, and Cook County itself is represented by about 1/3 of 2 senators. So there you go. There you can see where the bias comes in. But that was okay because it was written into the Constitution that way, so it, by definition, couldn't be unconstitutional. But that is an extreme case, and it's getting worse all the time. Okay, Illinois redistricting history briefly. Like every state, Illinois had to comply with the Supreme Court mandates in the 1960s to redraw its legislative districts, but because it was so painful, as I said, they just sort of didn't get it together. In 1964, they faced an election with no map, and the court said, okay, if you don't have a map, we'll just run the whole state as a single district. And that's what happened. Some of you may remember the so-called bedsheet ballot in 1964, where the House of Representatives, the state house, was essentially one giant at-large district, and everybody got to vote on all the Democrats and all the Republicans. It was a kind of a fiasco, embarrassment, and so They figured out how to solve that problem in the 60s. And then when we rewrote the Constitution in 1969, they set up a system to avoid this in the future, and a system to enable redistricting, and it set up this kind of prisoner's dilemma thing that the Constitution writers thought was going to promote compromise and harmony in redistricting, but in fact didn't do that at all. So okay, so you had the bedsheet ballot in 1964. That is sorry. Then the current process is, and this is for state legislative and congressional maps, and I know it's going to be different, but for local maps, but I assume it's going to be something similar to this. Okay, so the 1970 Constitution set up these steps. First of all, the legislature gets a crack at it, and they can pass the maps as a regular bill, signed by the governor, both chambers, you know, that sort of thing. And they have until June 30th of the year after the census to do that. If they don't get that done by June 30th, and that's June 30th of this year, by the way, then a bipartisan commission gets set up. I think it's 4 members of each party. They get together in a room and go to try to see if they can sort something else. And if they don't get that together by June 10th, then there's the random tiebreaker, which some of you may recall from 2001 when they had to do this, and Jesse White, who was the Secretary of State back in 2001 too, drew names from Lincoln's hat, and it turned out he pulled Michael Blandik's name. Michael Blandik was a Democrat, and so the Democrats got to draw the map. This is a sort of Russian roulette pact that the Constitution framers set up that they thought was going to promote compromise. They thought no party in their right mind is going to risk it all on sort of random tiebreaker. So it'll force them to compromise. Well, that happened in 1970, but that's the only time it happened. In 80, 90, and 2000, we had divided government, so they couldn't get the map done in the legislative process. And all 3 times it went to tiebreaker. Democrats won the tiebreaker twice, and Republicans won it one. Now this year, of course, and in 2010, the Democrats have united or undivided control. They control both chambers of the legislature and the governor's office. So presumably they're going to draw the maps the way they want them and get them passed. But thanks for the current or the previous census fiasco, incompetence, whatever, the first time in 230 years they couldn't figure out how to count the people in the country on time. We're not getting the data on time. And Mike can talk about that a little bit more, but so that opens up a lot of issues. But this is the process. Okay, and with that, I will stop sharing and turn that over to Brian Gaines, my partner in crime here. I'll go back.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I hope audio is clear to everybody. I'm not going to give you PowerPoint slides. Chris is using them. I think Michael will too. So we have a PowerPoint sandwich, and in the middle I'll insert something that I hope isn't pure baloney, but we will see. The political science, I think, wisdom on what you expect when the maps are drawn is just maybe implied by what Chris was saying, is when one party acting alone draws a map, they tend to draw a map that favors that party. And that usually means partisan gerrymander. If it's a gerrymander, well, it's for some would say it's just synonymous with redistricting. It's just a map drawn, but a map drawn with some political purpose. And so partisan purpose would generally be to maximize the number of seats. And the slightly counterintuitive until you sat down and looked at maps and thought about this a little more. What does it mean to be maximizing the number of seats? It means you draw extremely safe seats for the party that's disadvantaged, and you draw relatively close, but a little bit favoring the favored party, as many of those as you can, and then the favored party wins a lot of seats, and the disfavored party wins few seats, but wins them a big margin, effectively wasting votes. And that is by no means the only kind of map we ever see when one party acts alone, but that's sort of the acting alone tend to draw maps that look something like that. When parties are acting together, you have a commission of some kind, or there's divided government. Both Republicans and Democrats have to be involved in passing the map. You tend to get something a little different, and the jargon is an Incumbent Protection Act. There's more weight put on let's just keep all the incumbents happy, not change districts very much for people who are already in office. And that can aptly be described as a gerrymander as well, but it isn't the same kind of gerrymander. It isn't with basically designed to maximize the number of party seats won by one party. So that's a very broad generalization about what tends to come out of the process, depending on who's involved. A third option is that people drawing the map are nonpartisan, and then you could say, what's the prediction? Is will you get a fair map? Chris already raised the question of what is a fair map. He wasn't going to answer it. I will say a few things about it, but I'm not exactly going to give you an answer as well. But the nonpartisan option might be one where they pay no attention whatever to politics and draw it. You say, draw a map, make the districts as equal as you can in population, and we'll just see where the chips land. Or you could say, let's engineer it. Let's draw the most competitive map we can. Let's try to get a lot of competitive districts and not have any party wasting votes in districts that are overly safe. And again, political science has, I would say, a live debate about what you would regard as the best practice. I think there's a little more preference for this sort of explicit engineering, make it transparent, explain exactly how you're doing it, and say this is a map designed to increase competitiveness. That's all about partisan gerrymandering. The other half of gerrymandering is used lots of ways, and another usage is racial gerrymandering. And so as Chris was describing the evolution of redistricting, part of the story that he was emphasizing in the mid-60s was a strong emphasis on no more malapportionment. The districts have to be as close to equal as possible in population. But then the Voting Rights Act came along, and there was also increasing litigation about diluting minority representation. And so increasingly, the complicated constraints on redistricting have involved not drawing maps that will not produce sufficient minority representation. And if you teach a class in electoral law, you can spend the entire term going over a series of cases and how to measure racial representation and what's a fair map and if you have to draw majority minority districts to ensure majority representation, how big do the majority have to be, and so on. This also is a large ongoing debate amongst specialists, and the litigation jurisprudence is by no means completely settled, but I think if you're, again, giving the 1-minute version, you'd say the current understanding of requirements for map making is you have to be sure not to be diluting minority representation, and that means you have to draw districts to some degree that are going to make it more likely that you'll get racial and ethnic minorities represented, and then which racial and ethnic minorities will depend somewhat on the population in the jurisdiction. Right, so is every map drawn in a gerrymander? No, the language will be used that way. Do we have an agreed upon standard what is a fair map that we can say this one's fair and this one isn't? Not really. So what other question could you ask about it? Well, one thing you could ask is, what is the public like? There isn't a huge amount of polling on what people expect out of redistricting and what they like best, because I think the assumption is most people don't pay a lot of attention unless they're really interested in politics, they're directly involved. It's a little bit too arcane. But I've done a little bit of polling, some with Jim Kuklinski, my colleague, and Chris's colleague at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs. And one of the things we found is that people are not very good at telling you who's drawn maps. And if you ask them who drew the state map, who drew the US House district, who drew the county districts, most people don't know. And they'll tell you they don't know, or if they tell you they know, then they might give you the wrong answer. So there's not a great deal of attention or awareness. And to some degree that facilitates map makers drawing the kinds of maps I'm describing that could be thought of as having political purpose. But if you ask who should draw maps, what people like in maps, then there's pretty strong preferences. One of the things people like are simple shapes. When they see districts twisting around, they might not know what's up, but they think something is up, and it's something that they would rather not, they'd rather it's not be reflected in the map. Someone's cheating in some way for some purpose, and that's not the kind of map they would like. There's a pretty strong preference for nonpartisan or bipartisan commissions, as opposed to just letting the existing politicians draw the map that they want. And in a sort of complicated experiment, I've asked respondents to take a map a little bit like Chris's very, very stylized Colorado, give them a very stylized map drawing exercise and say, pick from 6 maps here. In a rectangular state, you've got to make equal sized districts, the populations have to be equal. And what I found is that even the people who say they're strong Republicans or strong Democrats don't tend to pick the map that will favor their party. They pick simple shaped maps. That was true when I did this a long time ago. I did it again this summer. It was still true, although this time around more people said they didn't know what to draw. And it's not surprising. It's not a very familiar exercise to people to pick amongst distinct maps. All right, so part of my charge was to not just to review what political scientists have, what's our analysis of redistricting look like, but to talk a little bit of local politics. Local politics is kind of ignored in a lot of the political science literature. You'll find tons of articles about the redistricting at the congressional districts at the state level. A good deal less about how counties behave, but the counties, and there's a lot of variation across states, basically election law in the United States, notwithstanding current democratic efforts to nationalize significantly more. Election law is state law. The states vary a great deal. But all across the country, in Illinois, in the more than 100 counties, there's a lot of other redistricting that's going on after the census, which is drawing districts for county boards. And those, for the most part, are going to be done in sort of the manner of the legislature. These sitting politicians are going to draw the districts. So what's the big challenge this year? Chris already said the census data are late. COVID came. COVID had at least two effects. One, it made it harder to count people, and the other, people were moving around. So even if we had a really good way of assessing the population that didn't involve contact and people going door to door, there was more movement and people were temporarily displaced more this in 2020 than past years. So the consequence is the data looked noisier than usual, and they've been delayed. And not just the redistricting, but the prior step for the congressional map is apportionment. You have to decide how many of the 435 districts are going to go to each state, how many of the seats go there, and they have to know how many districts to draw. And even that was delayed. With a process that's based on decennial census, you might think then, okay, well, the options are, if the data are going to be several months late, just push everything back and draw the maps later, wait for the data, or proceed with our best estimates that are not the correct census data. They're just estimates, and they'll be a little bit more subject to error, and maybe with COVID, even more subject to error than usual. What are states doing? Illinois so far is taking the latter step, saying we've got to push ahead. We're not going to have the actual correct data that we would ordinarily have. Can't be helped. We've got deadlines to meet. Chris talked about some of these deadlines that get kicked in at the state level. So why is there such a rush if we're talking about an election that's going to be in the fall of 2022? And again, it's because American elections are complicated and drawn out affairs. And we have primary elections, not typical in parliamentary elections. So it isn't really the general election date that dictates matters, it's the primary. And before that, candidates have to announce they're going to run. So there's a filing deadline well in advance of that. And Illinois, like a lot of states, to file, you have to collect signatures. So there's a petition, there are strict deadlines on when you gather your signatures. And all of that takes so much time that census data pushed back several months so that we don't actually have the apportionment done before the changeover of presidents, as would have been the case in an ordinary year. And we're going to be waiting until September, poses a real dilemma that if you're going to delay and wait for the data, then you have to make a lot of revisions. And I don't mean to say it's entirely impossible, but the divisions, that kind of delay would necessarily mean shortening filing periods, probably making changes to signature collections. So for the moment, Illinois is saying, just go ahead and do the mapping. And that's what they only. Let me just say that's, I have a warning, my internet connection is unstable. I hope my audio is still good and that warning is fleeting. Let me say a couple of points about what are the risks with this. In one respect, the fixation on population that Chris described is a little funny. Absolutely, the jurisprudence has been very little deviation. In congressional elections, the read of the constitutional requirement is the districts have to be basically exactly the same in the population. What's funny about that is the map gets used for a decade unless there's further litigation forcing further redistricting. So this exact population equality imposed on the districts is already by 2022 out of date. It's according to 2020, population shifts constantly. The census says, let's try to get our best estimate of population at a given instant, and they pick a random instant every 10 years. Say, this is where we think people are and who's there. And then you say, districts have to be drawn so they're all the same in population, knowing full well that people move and over the course of the decade and the 5 elections, the map will be used. The populations will shift. So you might think if only we had a better technology, we could have had an easy, perfect population monitor that would get the population annually. We just keep tweaking the districts. But there'd be problems with that too. Then people would even be less clear on what district they live in, and it's already something that, unless you're closely following politics, it's a bit arcane for people. And the ballot will tell them what precinct they're in, maybe, but not until they get down the race. They don't know the numbers of their districts, maybe at the state level, let alone the county level. So in any case, the tendency has been to say populations have to be perfectly close, perfectly equal for congressional districts, very close for state legislative districts, within something like 10%. And there are lots of cases where 10% has been deemed too high for states too. And in the vicinity of 10% for counties. But counties this year are thinking we're working with bad data anyway. And we don't know the direction of the bias. I think that's something we could sit around debate, and maybe Chris and Michael and I would have slightly different guesses, but it's just guesses right now. We don't know exactly how the estimates based on surveys from 2019 are going to be, how good or bad they're going to be at predicting where the final count of 2020, and that itself is, even though it's a census, is not described as an estimate, is in some respects an estimate. So you might think, all right, that means we just got to be closer. Last thing, I don't want to go too long, so I'll say I've been involved, Chris mentioned, I'm involved with an advisory group. It's not a commission as such, but that's helping the county executive in Champaign draw a map. Champaign is one of the counties, only 3, I guess, that have an executive separate from the board in Illinois. And the first step in the process is the executive will prepare a map and then present to the board, and then the board will proceed. They might use the map, they might substitute another, they might tweak it and amend it. We're going by these deadlines that mean that all this has to happen pretty soon. So we don't have this, nobody has the current census data, we're just using estimates. Collectively, we decided we'll just try to get very, very close populations, and we'll wait and see. But it's certainly possible that what will happen, I think, not just in Champaign, but elsewhere, is if the census data look a lot different from the estimates, there might be litigation and might be more redistricting than we'd expect. One thing I'd say about litigation is there's been more and more every decade since the 60s, the cases that Chris talked about, and there are a lot of challenges to maps at all levels in the United States after every census. So the other thing I'll say then about the group that I'm part of, this is sort of the second experiment in a row. Last time around, Champaign County had a commission. They put a lot of work into hearings. It was a bipartisan commission. They tried very hard to be transparent, I think. They proposed a map, and then the map that was actually implemented was a substitute map submitted at the last minute. That could happen again. This time around, we're not a commission, we're an advisory group. So I think what the county executive has emphasized is transparency. And that's another thing that the polls say people like, even if they don't pay a lot of attention to redistricting, and they want simple shapes, they don't know exactly why the complicated shapes are drawn. There has been a tendency to say this is such a technical issue, nobody can understand it except the experts, so people don't need to know what's going on, they'll just see the map when it comes out. But I think increasingly technology has meant it's easier for almost anybody to go online and find a way to draw a map. I think Michael's going to talk about a little more about some of the advances. And there's less reason to say we don't have to be transparent. So I think this group has, all the discussions we've had, the meetings are public. The maps we draw and the criteria we're using are going to be explicit. And I think the goal has been one that is not, is a nonpartisan goal. It's been to at least be as transparent as possible about how the map was drawn and why. And that could be one way people understand fairness, and they can disagree on whether that's fair. But I think it actually comports pretty well with public opinion. However, this is just underway. It's not done. We're getting close to the point where we have to have a map to recommend, and then there'll be summer deadlines for the board to act. And I think the interesting thing this year, and this is a good segue to Michael, I think, is when the census data finally come out, and there are a lot of maps drawn all over the country using the old data, how much will people say, oh no, or phew, it looks about what we thought? And we don't know yet. So with that, let Michael McDonald take it over. I will.
Thanks, Brian. And I do have a PowerPoint, so I will be making a PowerPoint presentation. And I also put some resources way at the very beginning of the chat. I will put them again after I give my presentation. And I will discuss some of those resources as I give my presentation. Just to give you a sense of who I am, I used to teach at the University of Illinois Springfield for a couple years before I moved on. I'm more of a academic who straddles the academic world and the practical world. So I've been involved in redistricting in 15 states over the years, and actually worked for redistricting authorities in drawing districts. Have had a couple of the lawsuits that I've been involved with go all the way up to the Supreme Court. One of them we won on a voting rights challenge against the congressional districts in Virginia. One of them, unfortunately, we lost, which is a partisan gerrymandering challenge on behalf of Republicans in Maryland. So I actually do have a very firm idea of what we mean by fairness, and perhaps in the Q&A we can discuss that later on. In the chat, and again, I'll put it there, is a book that I wrote with my co-author, Micah Altman, about the work we did in the last round of redistricting to open up the process so that there could be more public participation and transparency in redistricting. The electronic version of this book is free. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to learn more about what we did last round of redistricting, and also telegraphing some of the things that we're doing in this round of redistricting. Encourage you to read that book. It's short, it's not a long one, and there will be no test at the end, so you feel free to enjoy it. Part of what we're doing here with public mapping is creating software that allows people to draw districts through their browsers. We deployed this 10 years ago, and we are upgrading that software for this round of redistricting. We are going to deploy it with election data. That's another part of the component of the project we're working on. We've collected precinct boundary data for 2016 and 2018 elections, and now we're working on 2020 elections for nearly the entire country. We're going to get there for the entire country by the time that the redistricting rolls around. The census has given us a little bit more breathing room to get that work completed, but we have 6 more states to go, and we'll have the data. Illinois data is already there. We've posted it, and it's free for anybody who wishes to use it. And there are a lot of other resources that we're posting in terms of data. They're being used widely. Now, our district builder software, we're going to deploy it for congressional and state legislative redistricting freely for the entire country in the upcoming redistricting cycle. We are also deploying it for local redistricting. Most of you, I gather, are from localities, not statewide. And so we are already deploying this in support of Dane County's redistricting in Wisconsin, and we're talking with other localities across the country to also deploy the software to support their local redistricting. So we'll deploy nationally, and we're not the only game in town. There's other efforts out there. Some of you may be familiar with Dave's redistricting app. Dave Bradley and I talk quite a bit. We support what he's doing. He's using our data that we're providing for his app. So, I encourage you to also look at what he's doing. But he doesn't have the same sort of tools that we do to go down to the local level and do some other things that, so it's different projects that we're working on. We have very similar goals, though, for transparency and public participation. And there will be a lot of maps this cycle. Created by outside groups, and they're going to be legal maps too. It's although you hear so far a lot about how it's this is a technical process. We saw in the last round of redistricting that even a high school student can draw a legal map and can draw a map that is better on multiple criteria. We can argue about what's fair, but yes, fairness, competition, respecting local boundaries, compactness, voting rights, equal population, all of those things can be done better than what we're currently getting out of the redistricting process, because politicians are basically doing what Chris talked about earlier, which is drawing districts to really for their own political interests. They're not doing it necessarily for the public good interest, and that could be either their personal careers or it could be their party. the election data that we have. I'll again post these resources to folks. I've done a lot of practical work, and in the work that we've been doing in building precinct boundary lines, we've also encountered some work that I think is important for this audience. It relates to redistricting. It's not directly involved, but it does affect the way in which elections are administered at the local level. And that's that we started noticing that voters were not correctly assigned to the correct districts. And in some cases, this has actually led to lawsuits and judges ordering new elections to be held because there were so many voters assigned to the wrong district that that number of voters was larger than the margin of victory for the election. It's been a couple isolated cases, but as we've done this work across the country, we've seen lots of instances of this. And so this is not an isolated problem. This is a much more widespread problem. We've done work for the Virginia Division of Elections and the Colorado Secretary of State's office to audit the assignment of their registered voters to districts. And I am an advisor to the National States Geographic Information Council to assist states and localities to further develop auditing strategies for their own voter files. But I just want to give this sense of what we're talking about here and tell you why it's going to be really important for all of you to monitor the census data that you do receive. Now, this is 2010 data, and there have been improvements to it, but this is a cautionary tale. This red line here is where the Census Bureau believes is the locality boundary line between two localities in Virginia. The gray line here is where the state of Virginia believes that boundary exists in a database that they've created of shapes for their 911 database within the state. And then Esri, which was a very prominent GIS firm, believes that the line is this sort of dashed line here, slightly different from where Virginia thinks it is. And if you look really closely, you'll see this little dotted line. That's coming from maps that the localities have created that this particular map vendors has made available for the mapping software. So we got 4 different representations of lines. The 3, Esri, Virginia, and what the mapping vendor created here are very close together. They're not producing many errors, but that Census Bureau line is far off. In fact, we've even seen state boundary lines are incorrectly placed by the Census Bureau. Now, the Census Bureau has done a lot of work again to clean up these shapes over the last year. So the good news is that they're improved. But here in Virginia, the court said that localities had to use these census boundaries. And that created all these orphan people, these buildings, and these are registered voters who were essentially assigned to the wrong district because the localities in the state thought, well, we're using localities as a boundary. We're not using this census definition of what a boundary is. And under court order, though, all of these people here had to be reassigned to a new district. It created election administration problems because now you have to have multiple ballots, and so just a cascading number of failures, costing the state millions of dollars to fix this problem in both legal and sort of administrative overhead that they had to deal with in order to fix this. So when you do get that census data, we've talked a lot about the population data, but also look at that boundary data. It may not be as accurate as you may hope it to be when you're doing your own local redistricting or other city planning purposes. Talk a little bit more about the census issues that we're facing in this environment. We've already talked about the timing issue. Yes, the census was delayed. The apportionment numbers are delayed. They're going to be out at the end of this month. And part of that is due to COVID-related issues last year. Part of it's due to the Census Bureau itself saying, hey, we need more time. And the Trump administration put political pressure upon them to short circuit the end of the counting when the census wanted to go out and do some more follow-up work. And that led to some quality issues with the data. And so Census did not feel comfortable with releasing data because they were concerned about the accuracy of the data, and they needed to do further follow-up on the accuracy. So that's why we have the delay. We're going to get the apportionment data at the end of this month. Sometime towards mid to late August, we're supposed to get the redistricting data. Redistricting nerds will call this the PL 94-171 file. It's named so because of the public law that created or authorized its release and creation by the Census Bureau. This data will be released in August using this legacy format. That's fine by us, and it's fine for just about everybody who does redistricting. So all of the data vendors and all the GIS vendors are very familiar with that format on the FTP site. Us, like everybody else, we didn't process it and integrate it into District Builder, and everybody else is going to be doing the same thing. So I expect whenever we get that data, we'll, within the next few days, we should start seeing that data become available for redistricting purposes. So in terms of timelines, that's probably by beginning of September, hopefully, if we don't go up too far to towards the end of August, people will be doing redistricting using the PL 94-171 data. In advance of it, we've got people drawing districts using American Community Survey data, and I can discuss that a little bit more in Q&A. There are pitfalls with that, and also in terms of its accuracy, it's not really meant to be used at the local level for that purpose. And we're already seeing we're going to release a national database of ACS estimates in the 2020 census block so that people can do the redistricting in advance if they wish to do so. But again, that's really just to rough out the districts in order to have bulletproof protection against litigation in terms of malapportionment, which is what Chris mentioned very earlier. You're going to need that PL 94-171 data, unless you got really lucky and the data that from the American Community Survey just happened to be good enough, and it had errors in such ways that whatever districts you drew fit within the population equality that was required for your locality or for your state. That would just be happy circumstance, and it'd be wonderful if that happens for people, but I would not bet on it. So I would not use ACS for this to draw the districts and use that and enact that into law. However, there may be a legal purpose to do so, which is that absent drawing any districts, given timelines that are in state code or in state constitutions, having the districts in place means that the state or the locality gets the second bite at the apple to fix the constitutional infirmity if a court finds that there is an infirmity. So in some ways, drawing districts with the ACS data is a tactical move that some places are doing in order to anticipate that they will be in litigation, but they don't want the courts drawing the maps. They want their own map on the books so that the court can order them to fix that map rather than have a court just say, hey, we're going to draw our own maps. In September 30th, we're going to get the redistricting data in this new format. But again, I think most places, we're going to have the data out for people to use well in advance of that. But maybe you need that data for local planning purposes. And there are lots of reasons. There are lots of uses for these data for like school planning, for zoning, tenure, policing. There's so many uses for this data. We're only looking at the very one specific use case for redistricting. So I don't want to discount all those very important other purposes for these data, and you'll be able to get those starting September 30th through the web portals that the census will make available. Well, all of this delay and everything else means that we're concerned about the accuracy. And I was in a presentation yesterday where it wasn't a Census Bureau official, it was somebody who was close to the census, was saying that the first sort of check that they're doing on the reliability of the data indicates that there was a 3% error rate in 2010, And this time around, the non-response, I shouldn't say error rate, the non-response is 18%. But that's just initial. So, and it could be just the localities that they're looking at right now. That's just has to be circumstances about those particular places. I can't say anything about it firmly because this is all secondhand, but it makes sense. We know that census encountered accuracy issues, and that's why they asked for delays in the data, in the production of the data, because they wanted to do their own internal verification checks on the data. So likely there are problems here, and census is trying to fix those problems, and they must be pretty severe because they led to delays in the data production. But again, I can't say it with this point with certainty what's going on here. What I also infer from some of the conversations that I'm hearing is that census is going to have to impute more data than they did in the past because of, again, many of the challenges that were faced with COVID. And I saw in the chat, like, people weren't allowing an enumerator into the home. That causes problems. And so census is having to rely on proxy reporting more frequently from maybe neighbors or looking at administrative data to try to figure out what's going on with the data. So just say there's going to be potentially a lot of issues. And these issues are going to be exacerbated by something called differential privacy. And so I have to explain a little bit about what differential privacy is. So what census is required under Title 13 of the US Code to do is they can't release the individual results from the census. They release this aggregate data at census block level at the lowest level, which is basically the size of a city block. That's how they protect people's confidentiality. But it's been determined that, kind of like a Sudoku puzzle degree of reliability, what individuals' responses were to the census based on the aggregate data. So it's kind of like it's a puzzle. And with computers, the computing power that you can throw at this question these days means that you can process a lot of that data and you can actually resolve what individuals' responses were to the census. Not everybody, but you can do it for a large number of people. And the census calls this a re-identification attack. It's something that is percolating up in lots of different areas where we're concerned about the ability for people to re-identify individuals from aggregate data. So census is not the only situation where this is happening, but census has certain mandates under federal law. So they're very concerned about this issue. So what are they doing? They're applying something called differential privacy, or a disclosure avoidance system. It's got all sorts of different acronyms to it. In 2010, Census actually did something similar. They did a process called swapping, where they would take responses of people from neighboring census blocks and just swap them around. But this time around, Census decided to do something more rigorous, academically, scientifically rigorous, which was to add noise to the data using, essentially like the margin of error, what you think about for a poll. So we know, like, we get a certain level of support or approval for the president, and we'll get like a plus or minus number on it. The true number could be anything within that range. It's kind of like that. I mean, I'm just trying to give you a flavor of what the statistical approach is, but that's what Census is doing. The problem is when you apply margins of random noise to data, you can get negative numbers, and it doesn't make any sense to have a negative person. And so what Census is having to do is go back and do some post-estimation adjustments to the differential privacy algorithm so that you don't get negative numbers. And that's causing all sorts of other problems downstream. I'm part of a National Academy of Sciences advisory group to the Census Bureau on differential privacy. And we held a meeting about 1.5 years ago in DC, and we just documented all these problems that were appearing with the application of differential privacy, just nonsensical results in the number of children, for example, because when you get down to really small populations or small geographies, this margin of error increases, the noise increases. It doesn't matter so much for congressional districts. But when you get down to locals, redistricting other local purposes for the data, you start seeing noise that's so large that you're getting just nonsense back from the data. This is probably very frightening to many of you as I'm saying this. The good news is that Census has made some adjustments to what they're doing over the last year and a half. They've listened to the concerns from user communities about differential privacy and its application. Again, about a week and a half ago, I was on another call with Census Bureau, and I saw that some statistics that indicated that the accuracy has improved, but we're supposed to get a report and we're supposed to get some other data sometime within the next 2 weeks. It's supposed to be by the end of April, but it could happen before then. And that will give us a better look, because all I got were some initial tables and reports from Census in that presentation. So I think bottom line for many of you at the local level is, boy, you really need to look at your data. And you need to look for errors or things that don't look plausible, like census block that has people in it, that you know has people in it, but Census is telling you it has 0 people in it, or has a particular racial group in it, and it has none of that racial group in it. These are things that could happen. We don't know yet because we're not getting the data. So yet, so I'm just saying that you need to verify that data once you get it. And unfortunately, I have to say too, is that if you see a problem, there's not much you're going to be able to do before redistricting. The 2 programs that Census has for resolving problems, the Count Resolution Challenge and the Population Estimates Challenge, those usually, for most localities are going to be procedures that'll happen after redistricting is already done. There could be some cases like where there's a really big problem that the Census will fix the data. This happened 10 years ago in Norfolk, where the at-sea populations for Norfolk Naval Base were located in the wrong census block by about 2 miles. And that were, when I say at-sea populations, I mean like entire aircraft carriers were assigned, populations for those aircraft carriers were assigned to the wrong census block with 10,000 people in them. So that caused problems, and the Census Bureau actually went back and fixed that. But unless it's a huge problem of that magnitude, Census is not going to try to fix these problems immediately. They're going to wait. They're going to allow these challenges to occur. That's the process. Some states could take action on their own. There are discussions among states, some states to do their own counts. Some already do this. They redistribute felon populations, for example. There could be some adjustments that states decide to make on their own to the census data if they're seeing some real weird characteristics of the data. Okay, so with that, just wonderful positive news that I had to tell you about all the cautions for that census data. I will open it up to questions and invite Chris and Brian back in to answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Mike and Brian and Chris. And Brian sent us all a note that he has to teach at 1. We knew that was the case when we planned this, knowing that we would probably have lots of questions and wanted to go to 1:30. So Brian had to leave, and we thank him for all the information he presented. But now it's up to you to field the questions. And man, there are a lot of questions in the chat. So I don't know if you want me to go through and pick out some questions. Chris, I know you've been watching the chat, and maybe you just want to address some of that while Michael has a chance to catch up.
Well, a little bit, but they've been coming back pretty quickly. I was gonna say, a very inquisitive group, which is great. But if maybe you, Ann, would know these, you can see which ones seem to be accumulating and just toss them to us.
And
there are a couple at the very end, maybe prompted, Michael, by your presentation about, and I know that you did go into this a little bit, but especially for local places and, even our city of Urbana, wards, how those are maybe reapportioned. What kind of data should we be using, and how can we plan for or plan around those gaps in accurate data that you just described?
Well, the data that you should be using are the PL 94-171 data. That's the best protection that you have from a malapportionment lawsuit. But I'm very cognizant of the timing issues that we have involved here. We're also looking to do support local redistricting here in Florida, and our state legislature has not extended the deadline for redistricting, and so by the end of December, and we're going to be hard pressed to do so. So like other places, and this is what folks are doing now, is they're roughing out their districts using the ACS data. But you have to understand, and I telegraphed this in my presentation, that ACS data is not particularly accurate. It is, especially for local redistricting purposes, it's in order to get the American Community Survey data, ACS, down to a local level, you have to use what they call the 5-year ACS. That would be all of the surveys combined from the Census Bureau from 2015 to 2019. And that will get you down to something that's called the block group level, which is a collection of about 20 or so, depends on the area. Census blocks could be more like 100, I should say. And so then you have to, that's census block groups are not enough to draw districts with. So I mean, you'd be pressed to draw them districts out of block groups. You can do it, but in many cases you got to go down to you have a lower level of geography down to the census block. And already those block groups are going to have a lot of noise to them because you don't have a lot of survey responses for the entire country when you're at a very small level of geography like a block group. And you're certainly not going to have a large number of responses for different racial categories as well. So if your particular locality has a large minority community within it, you need to be very sensitive to the fact that the American Community Survey data may have a lot of error to it. Add on to onto all of this is that the ACS is actually weighted to the 2010 census, and so if any population shifts have happened that census isn't aware of, that's going to lead to error too on its own, apart from just the survey type of error that you have. And we know that this is going to happen. We know that the population estimates that the Census Bureau produces is going to miss what the census says is the population from the PL 94-171 data. That's happened every census. So you can expect that that's going to happen. And so you can't really do the redistricting with the ACS data by itself. You're going to need the PL 94, but you can start roughing out the districts. But again, it really depends on your locality, how lucky you're going to get as to what the quality of that ACS data is going to be in order to draw districts that are going to be close to what you're going to get for the PL 94-171 data.
Let me raise a point. That this was a very interesting point that you brought up, Mike, and this is one thing I've been wondering about in Illinois, that there's been such a clamor. The Democrats at state level have been pushing to use the ACS data. That's how they're going to go forward with it. And the logic of it, I guess, is that, I wasn't clear. Why were they doing this? It's going to get thrown. It's going to be challenged. Certainly at the state level, they're always going to change. It's almost always going to somebody being challenged some of these maps, especially in recent, go rounds. And with this is just a huge, monkey wrench that just allows anybody who doesn't like the maps, I don't know if it's standing necessarily, but it gives them leverage in court to say, look, they use they use the census data, use ACS, and the courts are going to have to figure this out because we don't, nobody knows, right? And it's going to have to get sorted out from court to court. And but Mike's point about the fact that if you lay down a marker these are maps we want, and they get challenged, then you have first dibs at editing them up. He doesn't have to go back to the whole process. Did I understand you correctly on that, Mike?
Yeah, that's the theory that I've seen bandied around as to why you want to draw districts with ACS data. If you are under a tight timeline and you have to have, legally, you have to have districts adopted by a date, a drop dead date, and that drop dead date may happen after the release, or before, I should say, the release of the actual redistricting data. You're better off getting some districts drawn using some basis for drawing them, like the ACS, and then cleaning up afterwards. Because if you don't have any districts, the procedure here, and this has already happened, by the way, in Minnesota, a court has already said, well, if the legislature can't draw its districts, we're going to do it with a court-appointed set of judges. And so that lawsuit's already there, and the court's already ruled on this. And so you don't want to be like Minnesota in many cases. And again, going back to what you said, Chris, politicians care a lot about how these lines are drawn. They want to have control over this process. They want to make sure that their home's not thrown in with another incumbent's home and then have some sort of death match to see who's going to win that seat in the future. So there's a lot at stake for politicians in this process. And so they would rather have control over it. And that's why you get the ACS maps drawn, and then you, hopefully in litigation, you'll be the ones that get to fix those maps rather than just have the court draw their own maps.
This has been quite a lively chat discussion, so I apologize if I'm asking something that was discussed because I was having trouble keeping up. But there was a question about, are you familiar with other countries that have systems for an inaccurate census and more equitable drawing of districts that we could consider, as something to do here since we're in this situation?
I have actually done some international work on redistricting down in Mexico, for example. I've worked with the Federal Election Commission. They're the ones who have authority over drawing the maps for the their National Congress, lower chamber. And basically what happened in Mexico is that the census failed. They failed to run a new census, and then they failed to do a new redistricting. So they have badly malapportioned districts, and that's happened now twice. So, I mean, that's basically what happened to the United States back in the 1920s. We failed to come to agreement on how to draw new districts and had a failed census. And so that's a scenario that could play out here, except we are going to get some numbers. So I don't, I don't know. I don't think we have to worry about a complete failure of the census at this point. I think most of the concern is about the accuracy. There is a lawsuit that originated out of Alabama that is challenging the use of differential privacy. They're claiming that in the lawsuit that census should just release the unmanipulated counts. And there's a hearing today going on that. So this is a live lawsuit. I will have to see where it goes. But we could see something going all the way up to the Supreme Court, I think within the next month or so, where we have something about some declaration one way or another about whether or not we can get the data even sooner or not. And so there's a lot of moving pieces here. I think we're just going to get the data as they are. There's a whole other legal question that relates to this, and I hate to go down so many different rabbit holes, but we know differential privacy adds noise to the data. What does it mean when we have noisy data to the jurisprudence that has been developed over the last decades on equal population and the required population you need to draw a voting rights district? We don't know. because we've never had to face this question before. But certainly when we think about a congressional district, usually you draw it down to precisely equal population so that, you know, at most it deviates by one person. But now it's got noise and everybody knows it has noise. So does that make sense anymore to do one person population deviation for congressional districts? What does it mean at the state legislative level? If you're really close to that 10% allowed deviation at the state legislative level, but you know that there's noise. And so again, there's just all sorts of questions are going to be opened for legal challenge and debate and deliberation over the next year as we move through this redistricting process.
And you know, this is always true. There's always lots of litigation because, again, people care about this. I mean, politicians care about this, and so when they see their ox being gored, they're going to do whatever they can to degore themselves. But this, the whole census debacle this year or last year with Census Bureau, you know, just you know, booting the pooch. It's just caused your problems way more than they need to be. And it's just caused all sorts of wild cards and they get thrown up in the air. But again, I suspect that the best approach is to, you know, proceed in good faith. Do what you can do under these conditions. Don't try to be too cute. Do the best you can with, you know, as supportive guidance as you can from Counties Association or alternative authority sources, and you know, expect lawsuits and then, you know, act as conditions on the ground change. I don't really, I mean, there may be some that just say, let's just wait to September to see what happens. But you know, I don't think that, I don't know. I mean, it seems like if you're pursuing in good faith, then you know, that's going to help you when time comes. I would suspect the courts aren't going to be any more happy than the legislature about any of this, because then they have to make the decisions, right? And that's, so they want to look for people working hard and doing things you know, properly, and you know, not trying to scam the system, I assume.
Just a note, I put 3 links into the chat again. One's for the district builder software that we're deploying. You can always try it out right now if you want. We have 2010 data in it at the moment. We do plan to redeploy with 2020 geography and ACS estimates. So that is should be showing up within the next month or so. I also put a copy of that book, so if you want to see what we were up to last decade and what our plans are for this decade in public mapping. And then lastly, I put a link to the data that we're currently making available. And again, we have not posted the ACS data there yet, these estimates that we've come up with, but we do plan on doing it. We actually have them. We're just, we're sort of, before we post them, we want to make sure they're going to be in the right format for use in District Builder. So I would expect in the next month, in the next week or so, we'll have those ACS data posted on this website. And you can also see the precinct boundaries that we came up with. I know that the Illinois state government hired up a mapping consultant to do Illinois. I don't know. I suspect our precincts are more accurate because we found some errors in that data, but maybe not. I don't know. But certainly, you know, if you see any errors in the precinct boundaries that we've come up with for 2016, 2018, which we have posted on that site, I certainly please contact me, and we want to have the most accurate data as we possibly can for those boundaries and for the election results.
Michael, there was a question a little earlier. You had mentioned that in Minnesota, there were judges appointed to create the maps, and who are those people, and did that work well, or was that not good for the locality?
Well, when there's a failure and there's no political solution to produce a new map, courts are going to step in and draw new maps. Now they have 2 options. One option is that they adopt a map that has already been through the process, the redistricting process. It may be the legislative process, it may be a commission process or something of that nature. So that's one option for the courts. Yeah, about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, courts didn't have the capacity to draw their own maps. And so that's often the solution they looked for, was a map that they thought was a good map out of the legislative process. Well, today, courts can hire or commission special masters, is what they're called, to draw the maps and produce maps for the court. And we've seen increasing usage of special masters over the years. And so you could hire an academic. That's what sometimes, some of the people that I know who do redistricting, like Nate Persley at Stanford, Bruce Kane at Stanford, Bernie Groffman at UC Irvine, they've all been hired to draw maps for courts. So that's an option. Now the courts could also look to other people, and so that's basically what's happened in Minnesota. It's not that those retired judges have drawn the maps yet. It's that the court has appointed those judges in case the legislature fails to draw the maps in a timely manner. So they're sort of setting up the process so that things can move very quickly, because Brian was mentioning this in his presentation. There's a very tight deadline that we're dealing with here. You've got candidate filing deadlines in the new districts before the primaries. That's when the districts have to be drawn by. Courts could order delays. That's possible. And we will probably see some of that. That courts are going to order delays in elections because of the car pileup that's happened with redistricting and the release of the data. But that's what Minnesota's doing. They're anticipating what's going to happen. Now, I would also suspect that those set of retired judges in Minnesota are not going to be the ones who actually draw the districts. So I would still expect them to hire a mapping consultant to help them with the drawing of the districts. So I would not be surprised if you still see some academic or some knowledgeable company or individual be a mapping consultant to those judges in Minnesota.
But Mike, and judges over the years, lots of have supervised maps for various reasons, including the bedsheet ballot, for example. That was a court-ordered situation here in Illinois. Is there research to show that they are better or worse able to meet various criteria and desiderata than legislatively produced maps?
Well, by and large, their goal is to get out maps within the time frame and before candidate filing deadlines. So that's primarily the purpose. And courts have had mixed strategy on what they do for what maps are going to adopt. So often in the past, what courts would do is they'd look at the current lay of the land and try to offer the least disruption to the current map. And so whatever biases are baked into the current map, that court is just going to carry forward with those current biases. Now, more recently, we're starting to see state courts, not the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court won't touch this anymore, but the state courts, places like Pennsylvania, Florida, maybe North Carolina, have looked into their state constitutions and found fairness criteria and have adopted maps that, I know you don't want to touch it, Chris, but that are fair, politically fair. Basically the fairness criteria is that the percentage of districts matches the statewide vote that you're getting on average within the state for the two political parties.
But you haven't seen some of your colleagues go through and do an analysis comparing court-ordered maps to legislative produced maps based on the various criteria that we set up?
Well, again, those court-ordered maps out of Florida and Pennsylvania are objectively fair by using these metrics about.
But nobody apparently has compared them. We haven't seen that study in APSR.
Well, sure, it's they're young enough so they haven't made it into a journal yet. That's a fair criticism, but I think.
No, I just want to know. I mean, this has been going on for 50 years. Towards have been
right.
System. So there's been plenty of time. Somebody could have done it long before you got into the business.
Yeah, but there's been a change in this the decision making that the courts are applying to redistricting, such that they're now drawing their own maps, and in some cases they're adopting maps that are politically fair, like with the intention of drawing politically fair maps. So that's where I'm quibbling with you, Chris, is that yeah, you could look back in the past. Mostly courts were trying to not rock the boat. Was what their intention was. And so you don't see a lot of difference between court-ordered maps and what you might have gotten through the regular process. But now you're seeing courts do things that are fundamentally different, and not everywhere, because not all courts are behaving in this way. But there are some courts out there that are bringing in fairness as one of the criteria that they see as important within their state constitution to adhere to. And those maps, I think, are putting some constraints on how you're getting partisan gerrymanders out of those states, because we certainly saw much different maps than what the legislature produced out of places like Pennsylvania and Florida.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for at least one more question. So 55 ILCS 5/2-3004 requires the county clerk to convene the county apportionment commission if the reapportionment is not completed the day after the board's July meeting. If the data is not available before that date, won't all counties be using their CACs?
CAC, I'm sorry.
County Apportionment Commission.
I think there's a difference between this statute and the constitutional provision with having to do with the state legislative and congressional districts. That is set in the state constitution. And there's no for the state legislative and the congressional districts. That's set. Those dates are set as dates. They're not like 30 days after this or soon after. Nothing. It was June 30th, August 10th, October 5th. Very specifically in the Constitution. And there's no way to change that at all. I mean, because the constitutional revision takes, it's a multi-year process, right? So they can't change, the courts can't do that. I mean, could the state Supreme Court come in and say, well, we're going to reinterpret this? Yes, that is a possibility, but given how, small c conservative the Illinois State Supreme Court is, I really, I'd be surprised if they do that, unless there's like a huge catastrophe or calamity or something like that. Because look what they did on the pension crisis. We're $130 billion deep in debt on a pension crisis, and they read the plain language of the Constitution and said nothing we can do about it. I think they would do the same thing in this situation. And then the difference is for the statute that you cite is that statute, and that can be changed. And that could be adjusted in the spring legislative session by the state legislature. So I just expect you'll all be getting on the phone to your member to get that done, so you don't get forced in that position.
Yeah, I should add that Georgia had a deadline that was coming up too. And I know there's been a lot of controversy over the law that was passed in Georgia around election issues. But there was tucked into that mega bill, it was like, over 90 pages of legislation, was a provision to give the localities in Georgia more time to get the redistricting done. And there's, as I said, in Florida, we got this December deadline coming up. And really what we're talking about is mid-December, because there's the holidays. So, and then you got to back it up even further that we have to make proposals and have those in the public records. So you really look at the end of mid-November, I should say, not end of November, mid-November to have plans that are drafted up. So that's not giving us a lot of time. And again, there's a lot of interest here in Florida to lobby the state government to extend that deadline. But there's been no bill seen yet. So I agree with Chris, like you guys, if this is an issue and it concerns you, start lobbying, start notifying people that this is a serious issue and that there needs to be some sort of legislative fix before it's too late.
It
Well, we're-
strikes me that this would be a bipartisan effort, no brainer. If all the county, 102, counties get together and say, this is what we need, it'll get done right quick. But you got to talk to them about it and you got to get them to do it. Otherwise it won't get done.
While we're finishing up and talking, we can keep talking, but Nancy's going to post the poll. She just did. So you can submit that while we continue to work through the questions.
I just wanted to mention, I'm a county board member myself, and we already created our reapportionment committee at our last board meeting. So I guess we're just trying to get ahead.
On the ball.
Yeah.
Well, I wish I had better news to give everybody about what's going on here. But the deadlines and the accuracy issues are just a double whammy on this redistricting cycle. And I know I'm trying to help out as best as I can with the situation that we have. But I don't, I don't envy any of you who have to face this crisis in Illinois, because you've got even more immediate deadlines than we're facing within Florida. But you're not alone. I mean, it's happening everywhere in relation to your woes.
Well, and to your point, I forget the name of your association, the County Board Chairs Association. I'm sure that, like there's a county association, right? They need to get on this, right? They need to, this should be the number one thing on their agenda, and it may already be out there. I don't know. I mean, if it's not, then they're asleep at the switch. So, and you need to wake them up. They will respond to you. Your interest group leaders will respond to you if you tell them what to do. But if you don't, they'll do whatever they want to do. So you've got to give them guidance.
Someone did say they were at some sort of event yesterday, and there were legislators, I don't know how many or who, that said that there is no consideration being given to changing county deadlines or election filing deadlines. So,
Well, and then you need to take care of that.
Yeah.
That's your job.
Well, the other
Make it
solution,
happen.
the other solution is court action. I mean, that's
And that's a wild card.
right. Can you get a court to extend the deadline? And that has happened. I mean, we've even seen, courts order new elections. I mean, in the most extreme case, we've seen general election moved date for in North Carolina back in the 1990s. So, I mean, crazier things have happened with courts in terms of their interference in elections. They don't want to do it, but I think objectively, this is a serious enough situation that a court may be amenable to offering some relief.
So I'd like to say thank you very much to all of you and Brian for speaking with us today. Thanks to all our participants. We had a large group, and I would say at least 2/3 or more stuck it out through the whole 90 minutes. So we appreciate that. Extension did record today's webinar. It will be available on the local government education website within a few days. Nancy will send an email out to those who are registered for the webinar today, letting you know when it's available. We had, like I said, really great discussion in the chat box amongst each other and with questions, and a lot of positive remarks, and thanking you all for being with us today and sharing all the information that you did. And I'm sure that was a lot of preparation, and we appreciate it. Ann or Nancy, I don't know if I missed anything, if you want to finish up.
Nancy's posted the poll, so thank you all for responding to the poll, and you can finish that up if you haven't done it. I just want to thank both Chris and Michael, and of course Brian, and then everybody who submitted questions. It was kind of a free-for-all in the chat, so that kept our conversation going too. So I think that maybe we're not finished talking about this topic. I think clearly we're not finished talking about this topic, but really appreciate the insight you provided, and also all those kind of practical, where the rubber meets the road kind of questions that came up in the chat. So thank you again.
Well, thank you.
Well, good luck, everybody.
Yeah, good luck.
Good luck. And really, if you do see errors, especially in our data, please let us know. But just be on the lookout for those errors with the census data. It's the best advice I can give you at this point about the accuracy issues.
Someone said famous last words. Good luck.
2030
Yeah.
In
good luck.
2030, you'll all be experts in 2030. So next time you got to do this, you can it'll be easy.
You know, it's such a shame because we are spending a lot of time thinking about who gets to vote and where and for whom. And then, you know, you look at these local elections. We just had, we had such poor turnout, contested local races and very poor turnout. I couldn't believe the low turnout in our local elections.
Yes, I commiserate with you on that too. I produced what many consider to be the official turnout rates for the country in another hat that I wear. And yes, the turnout for local elections is abysmal in this country. We need to do something more about
Maybe
that.
we can revisit this with you all in 6 or 9 months and see where things are at that point. There was already a request for a continued conversation in the chat box.
Yeah, I think this is going to be of interest to people as time goes on and we get closer to these deadlines, or we pass the deadlines and then we're looking at what do we have in hand and what are the options going forward. So I think, you know, maybe we should revisit this after the June 30th deadline, see where we are.